Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be building a C-3PO bust that will double as a helmet for my son's Halloween costume. Alright, for starters, these are free files that I found on Thingiverse. I will link them as well as all the materials I used down in the description below. Per usual, this project started out with a ton of filling and sanding. Still using my trusty wood filler, and I'm always prepping my PLA parts first so that the wood filler has time to dry while I sand the resin parts. To quickly remove support marks on resin printed parts, I'm usually using 120 grit, and for anything that needs to look pretty, I'm working from 220 up to 400. Once the wood filler is dry, I typically do a quick pass of 120 and then finish with 220. Here and there, I'll use 320 grit if I feel like something needs to be a bit smoother, and then it's on to filler primer. I typically do a pretty thick coat at this stage, since it's the best way to guarantee that I'll only need to do one more pass of sanding. And in a Brunger Builds first, I dropped the faceplate while the primer was still wet, and got a bunch of lovely little bits of dust and dirt embedded in the primer. My solution to this was to immediately wipe away the wet primer and dirt, and then soak those areas with a bunch of extra primer. This primer does a pretty good job at self-leveling, and so once it was dry, I was able to knock back the excess and have a nice, clean surface. Before paint, I needed to install a few of the resin-printed greeblies. For some reason, the back panel of the head does not come printed with a big enough hole to fit the antenna greebly in the top, and so I had to widen that out a bit. I then did some careful drilling and used 18-gauge brad nails to act as secure anchors between glued-up pieces. And then it was onto a coat of flat black, and once that had dried, some high-gloss 2K clear. The gold Alclad paint I'll be using in the next step needs a high-gloss black base in order to be as reflective as possible. However, after seeing the results I got with the Alclad, I think I would have been just fine sticking with my usual satin black base, which would have saved me having to do 2 spray sessions and waiting for 2 separate paints to dry. But we'll talk about that more later. While the gloss was drying, I worked on the eyes. The eyes are actually made up of 2 separate files I found on Thingiverse and had to tweak slightly to work together. I'll link both of those in the description. Aside from that minor tweaking, it was a pretty standard soldering session, just making sure I wired a resistor on the negative and ran a 9-volt battery to the 6 LEDs. Wiring all this up was pretty time consuming, and it made me wish that I had bought pre-wired LEDs way back when, which would have saved me a bunch of time over the last few projects. But you live and you learn. Because my LEDs come from a big pack of white lights that I bought a long time ago, I used a couple drips of clear resin and yellow and orange alcohol ink to dye the bulbs, and then did a bit of touch-up on the little black ring that will be seen in the center of the eye. Alright, let's talk about Alclad. In a previous project, I had used Alclad's gold titanium and gotten really great reflective results, doing the same process of flat black and 2K clear gloss. Unfortunately, my hobby shop was completely out of gold titanium and only had pale gold, and because I was in a bit of a rush, I just went with this option. After using the paint and doing a bit of research online after the fact, it seems to me that pale gold was not made to be as reflective as gold titanium. The pale gold is still a nice color, but ultimately its sheen is not nearly as reflective and ends up being a bit more satin than I was expecting. Because of this, like I said earlier, I think I would have been just fine doing a single coat of satin black as my base, and then going over the top of this gold with the 2K gloss. Instead, what I ended up doing was using 2 full cans of 2K gloss to act as a base coat and as a clear coat over the Alclad. Not only was this a waste of time, but also a waste of materials, since 2K clear coat is not cheap. Here you can see me trying to buff out the Alclad to make it just a bit shinier before doing that final top coat of 2K clear. Okay, for the weathering, I kept it real simple. Like I said in the beginning, this bust is going to double as the helmet for my son's Halloween costume. And because I don't know if it's even going to survive the night, I didn't want to get too carried away with the amount of detail that I put into it. So I just mixed up a thick black and brown acrylic wash and went to town. I was roughly basing my weathering off of the way C-3PO looks on Tatooine in A New Hope. And because he's a bit extra dirty in those scenes, I made sure to give him a couple of drips in strategic places around his head. I did a couple more drips on his chest plate, and my final touch was to add a bit of mesh on the backside of his mouth. And then this droid was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. This project had a few bumps along the way, but it also ended up being one of the quickest turnaround times of any of my projects. I'm very excited about this build, mostly because my son is so excited. And I just hope that it survives the night without too many bumps or scratches, so that maybe one day, in the distant future, his son can also wear this costume as an heirloom from old Grandpa Brunger. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a video every Saturday. And I'd like to say a quick thank you to the over 4,700 people who have subscribed to the channel up to this point. I appreciate you all watching and wish you all a happy Halloween.